This reading is, I think, a very important occasion to think about where we are as a society and where we've been in the last several hundred years. Because Francis Bacon was one of the great architects of the scientific revolution and of the technological society of which to which we all belong. So I think in this literary work, this fable that he's constructed of the new Atlantis, we have a very subtle way of trying to consider the various factors that technology brings into play, including desire and politics, nationalism, imperialism, things that maybe difficulties that Bacon himself understood, maybe not. In any case, he's given us an occasion to try to grapple with them as we must now. Because I think one thing the environmentalist movement has done for us is to try to get us to see that there are difficulties in the kind of approach that the Western world has taken to the natural world in the last several hundred years. So this is a great entree to that great conversation about how we should live in a technological age. So Bacon was born in 1561 and he died in 1626. He was the child of a second marriage of Sir Francis Bacon, who was at one point the second most powerful counselor to the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. Unfortunately, his father died before he, who was the sixth of his sons and the last of his sons, could have his estate settled upon him. So Francis was not left with any means to support himself, really. He had enrolled at Cambridge, I think it was Cambridge. It was Trinity College in Cambridge when he was, 13 or something like that, and studied the late scholastic method there that was still being taught, and he was not happy with the scholastic method that was given to him. So Aristotle became a symbol for him of what was holding back the human race from developing its productive capacities, or actually, in fact, coming to understand what we could understand with the power of the human mind. He went on to study law at the Inns of Court, Gray's Inn, and he became a very, because of his natural gifts, he was a very good lawyer. He would eventually come to serve the Commonwealth as an unappointed counselor, which was one of the things that if you were bright, you did in the kingdom. You offered advice to the monarch, which may or may not be taken up. Eventually, he was made a parliamentarian, and at one point he opposed one of the tax increases that Queen Elizabeth wanted and suffered a great political setback after that. So he was not actually set back on course to rise politically until after the accession of King James in 1603. Eventually, his rise under King James was meteoric. He would end up being the Lord Chancellor of Britain, and that was in 1618. And he was, in fact, created a noble in 1621. Created Viscount St. Albans in 1621. Later that year, though, one of his other roles that he was playing, he was a judge at Chancery, one of the appellate courts, and he had received gifts from two of the suitors in cases that he was presiding over. The cases went against those suitors, but because of the politics of Parliament at the time, who were against Lord Buckingham and King James, he was made to be the fall guy for a practice that was in fact not that uncommon. He was not paid as a judge. This was one of the transactions that occurred, but so he was made to be labeled a false holder of office, and so he fell from power completely, and that left him in basically the last 5 years of his life to concentrate on his literary and natural philosophical works. So that was the blessing. We've seen this pattern before. Dante went into exile and he wrote his Divine Comedy. Machiavelli lost power and could write his Prince, and Bacon was forced to become the prolific, well, he, up until this point, he had been so active in politics and so active in the law that he had not been able to apply his mind in the way that he really wanted to, in the way that he was clearly gifted to concentrate on natural philosophy and advancing natural philosophy, which is the name that was used for what we call now science. So in 1626 is when he died. So that the next year is when the New Atlantis showed up as a kind of an appendix to this great, massive work, the Silva Silvarum. Bacon was known as, or has been recognized as, a great literary stylist, one of the great shapers of the English language. And it is true that he's got a very elegant style and an elegant mind. What we see in the New Atlantis, I think, which is a strange little work of fiction. We have the whole thing in front of us. We know that it's structured by three large conversations. One with the governor of the stranger's house, where the visitors are quarantined. One with the Jew, Joabin, and who describes the family practices of this society, Ben Salem. And then the last is with one of the fathers of Salomon's house, which is this massive project of science fiction technological enterprise. So this is the kind of wide context in which Bacon wants to have us consider technology as a project. We think about politics, we think about economics in that kind of basic sense of the law of the household, the marriage law, the celebration, this literally patriarchal celebration of the Tirsan, the head of a household that has come to produce 30 children. It's very enlightening, but it's also interesting. Why is this being talked about in a work that is ostensibly trying to argue for the advancement of science as a social institution? It was taken to be such in the years that followed. It was one of the inspirations for the Royal Society in Britain. So it was understood that Bacon's rhetorical advocacy for scientific work and for moving beyond what he called, what he thought of as the mere verbalism of the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages. So we've seen this in several authors, and we'll continue to in this early modern period, trying to understand the shift from the scholastic method in a decadent form, this kind of use of Aristotle, who was himself a great natural philosopher who actually did a lot of experiments. But by the time we get to the 1500s and 1600s, that scholasticism, which was still being taught in the schools, did not have the experimental habit anymore. So if you thought that what it takes to make human beings better off, and as it's often quoted, right, that the relief of man's estate is Bacon's great concern, and it is, but the whole quote is very important. He says, "Knowledge is the rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate." And I think one of the most striking things about this work is that you do find an immense Christian piety. Now, I think we need to discuss how odd this Christian piety is, starting from how the island of Ben Salem is evangelized. But I think it's quite clearly sincere. So there are many modern conservatives who like to trash Descartes and Bacon and others for giving us modernity. I think that's problematic in all kinds of ways, including the fact that we're all beneficiaries of modernity. But so it's one thing to say technology has dehumanized us in many ways. It's another thing to say technology is a bad project, which is, of course, a foolish thing to say. So we have to distinguish. We have to say, when we ask the question, how should we live in terms of the technological era that we find ourselves in, we have to distinguish between the things that are both humanizing about technology. And he isn't anti-religious. So one technological problem we've got now is that increasing technological power tends to make us less religious as societies. So that's a thing we have to kind of see if Bacon provides us any intellectual resources to deal with. That's a conundrum that is very pronounced. The other issue that is very prominent is this question of the relationship of knowledge and power. He does say once, those twin objects, human knowledge and human power, really do meet one. And this it's a Foucauldian kind of critique. It's also done by conservatives to say, well, what Bacon did was to poison the pursuit of knowledge with the pursuit of power. But Bacon's concern clearly was to use power to be philanthropic. He literally uses that word, that his desire is his love, to serve the love that he has for humanity. How do you, in fact, do that unless you're actually applying your mind to bring about a better kind of life for people? He wants to actually change the material circumstances of people's lives. And he also wants to change the intellectual circumstances. It wasn't just that he thought that we are living in a benighted age. He was also backwards in terms of technology, but we were living in a benighted age backwards in terms of what our minds were free to do. And he wanted us to be on the lookout to see the possibilities in what in nature that God has given us. He wanted to amass great fields of facts to try to induce the theories that induce more general understanding about the working of nature, so that we can in fact have more power. He wanted to return us in fact to a kind of, and in his mind it was a Genesis account, where he wanted us to return to a pre-lapsarian state in which technology was helping to make up for some of the effects of the fall. That was kind of his approach. So I think we need to take him seriously as very complicated, that he was part of a scientific revolution that we all depend upon, that has in many ways, of course, made a life that we, none of us would ever give up, but it also has caused us very great difficulties and has in fact been very hard on the least powerful. But it also has made possible the kind of alleviation in the very base level of subsistence that most humans have had to endure throughout history. So I think it's a very complicated subject that we need to take approach with great subtlety. The questions that I think might be useful to at least serve as points of orientation. Number one, how does the Christian piety of the New Atlantis harmonize with the novelties of Ben Salem? What is novel about how Ben Salem was evangelized? I think that as a theologian, I'm going to be sensitive to that. I think that might be an important question. Number two, how does this work show the Western technological project implicated with patriarchy and an assumed Euro-Christian cultural standpoint? That might sound like a politically correct question, but it's actually very much on the surface of this thing. Ben Salem is a very interesting kind of nation. It is a nation with, I think, the potential of imperialist power, and it stands in a place with regard to the rest of the world that Western Europe stood with regard to the newly opened up to them lands of the new world. So we have to think about how this work has reflected on a project that has, by that point, gone on for about a century and a half. Question three, what is the relation of Salomon's house to the government of Ben Salem? Is there any political oversight of the scientific elite? And number four, what is the purpose of Salomon's house? How does this early example of utopian science fiction accord with later technological advances? I think that might be a good place to start. I think I've put a few things on the table, so I look forward to a very, very vigorous conversation.